Hey, what's up, YouTube people? It's Mike. Taking on some upgrades to the Corvette today, to the LS Swapped C3 project. Stuff I probably could have done differently from the start, but you know, you make choices. Number one I've got is the fuel lines going to the fuel sending unit are CPE currently, which is chlorinated polyethylene. Basically, it's reinforced rubber, stainless braid. It's good stuff, but not as good as it could be. I'm going to go to PTFE, which is polytetrafluoroethylene, I think. And basically, the big difference between the two types of line is the CPE is basically reinforced chemical resistant rubber with a stainless braid, or nylon braid, or stainless on the outside, however you get it. And PTFE has a Teflon inner liner, which is much tougher and is impervious to chemical degradation. The PTFE also has a higher burst strength, so it can take higher pressures. You can use it on power steering and brakes and that kind of stuff. When you buy Russell and Aerogrip, performance brake lines, they're PTFE lines with the Teflon lining inside. They can take several thousand PSI repeatedly without failing, whereas rubber obviously couldn't. Even stainless braid will fail under brake and power steering pressures, which are often 1,000, 2,000 PSI. The reason I went to CPE originally is CPE because it's mostly a rubber hose, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. I've got this is my AN fitting and plumbing kit, which is constantly under development, but I've got some old CPE line in here. All right, so there's CPE. It's basically reinforced rubber. It's got a stainless braider on the outside for strength, plus a black nylon, cool looking coating. But basically it's rubber inside. This is PTFE line, also in 6AN. And you can see it's got a solid Teflon liner in the middle. And it also has a thin layer of rubber and then the stainless and nylon braid on top of that. And so one of the advantages to CPE is that it's a little more flexible. It'll contour around corners a little better. You can bend it a little tighter. Whereas the Teflon, the PTFE lines, you can kink, you can crush it. You can't cut it with shears, like a straight cutter like one of these guys. These are great for, These are great for cutting hose and all kinds of stuff. But you can't really use them for PTFE, because what will happen is, since that liner is stiff, it will collapse it. And you can straighten it out, but every time you collapse it, especially these pinch points on the outside where it got sharp, darn well that liner is going to be cracked up a quarter of an inch or half an inch, and so you end up chasing your tail. So definitely the best way to cut them is going to be with a Dremel or an abrasive tool, and we'll show that in a few minutes. The fittings are also different using PTFE or CPE. And as a quick and easy way, this Barrera section is all 6AN stuff. You can see it's all the same size. And I've got, those are like GM fuel filter adapter fittings, and I've got unions. Let me grab a couple of 6ANs. All right. And I'm going to grab a tripod so I can sew this without juggling the camera with one hand, because I hate when people do that on YouTube. Hold on. All right, so the difference between, these are both 6AN. They're both the same size, as you can see. The difference between PTFE and CPE fittings is you'll notice one has a flare at the end and one is straight cut. And there's some slight variance among manufacturers, but that's the easiest way to spot them, in a box going through them. The bigger difference is, if you look inside, is a PTFE fitting has a ferrule. So if we take these guys apart, and here's a CPE fitting, which is just rubber. Basically, the rubber slips over, and as you thread this, it's got threads on the inside. As you thread this onto the hose, and then as you put these two together, it forces this taper up into the hose and seals the hose. PTFE works a little differently. It's got a ferrule inside. So this ferrule goes on the end of the hose, and it goes between the Teflon liner and the stainless braid. After you slip this on, notice there's no threads. So you slip this on the hose first, you put this between the Teflon liner and the braid, so it's on the end of the hose. And then this goes inside the Teflon liner. And as you tighten this down, the bevel inside, if you don't know how compression fittings work, the bevel inside engages the bevel on this ferrule and squeezes the ferrule and basically seals it through compression onto the fitting. I don't recommend reusing these. If you need to take it apart, the ferrule is going to be clamped. It's going to be a bear to try to get it onto a new hose. These aren't terribly expensive. You can get them even from Amazon, from cheaper vendors, and they're not terribly expensive. And it's always good to have a bunch of these on hand. That's why I've got a bunch of PTFE fittings. You can get a whole kit with hose for like $50. Evil Energies, a bunch of companies making them. Of course, there are top-end lines like Air-Equip, and you can get Russell as well. It's all real good stuff. But honestly, some of the aftermarket stuff isn't awful. And, you know, I usually have a bunch of these fittings laying around. The traditional CPE AN fittings you can reuse over and over again. Just unthread it off the hose, cut the hose, do whatever you got to do, thread it on, put it back together. So that's a benefit of CPE as well. So CPE, you can bend tighter radiuses without kinking the inside. You can reuse the fittings. That's the regular rubber CPE hose. What else? Is there any other pro to CPE? It's a little cheaper. But, you know, really, in all things considered, how many times you're running lines? I mean, I do a bunch of performance lines here for, you know, power steering and trans cooler and oil cooler and all that stuff. And traditionally, I use some cooling steam vent hoses and that kind of stuff. I mean, I traditionally use a lot of 6AN, occasionally 8AN and 4AN. If I'm doing cooling lines to a block, then it would be like, they'd be much larger, like, you know, 10, 12, 16AN. And so it isn't that expensive to go to PTFE and just cut to the chase. The downside to PTFE, of course, is it's a little bit more expensive. You may have to use more fittings because you can't bend the hoses tight, so you may use additional angle fittings that you wouldn't traditionally use. You know, with a CPE, you can grab the hose and you can tweak it and get it to go, and you can bend the PTFE fittings, PTFE hose, but depending on how tight of a turn you need, depending where your hose is routed, you might need to go with a different fitting or a bulkhead fitting or something like that. But I definitely recommend PTFE hose and fittings as long as you have no significant interference issues where you need to have that bendability of CPE. It doesn't really save you much going with CPE. So I still have some for occasional use. It's almost more for dress up than anything else. You know, if I want to dress up a coolant overflow line that's not under any pressure, or you know where you need to. The other benefit to CPE is because it's rubber lined, you can fit it over barb fittings. So if you don't have an AN fitting that you're mating to, and you're going to use CPE line where it's not seen, and you want to slip it over a barb and put a hose clamp on it, you can do that with CPE because it's just a rubber hose, so you can collapse it. Even with the stainless braid, you can collapse it enough to grab a barb fitting and seal. PTFE, since it has that hard Teflon liner inside, not so much. You're not going to slip this over a barb fitting. And that's one of the reasons I have CPE currently on the fuel pump coming out of the Vet, because the Vet has the original, well, it's not the original, but it's original style fuel sender for the Vet, which had rubber hoses pigtailed off it because it was a lower pressure system going to the original crossfire injection throttle body. So they just used you know, a fuel injection rubber hose with clamps on the end. So there are barb fittings on the sending unit. And I didn't want to, at the time, I wanted to get it together and get it running and start, you know, troubleshooting issues before I made any real permanent mods in some cases. So I just used CPE hose between the fuel pump, the fuel filter / regulator, which is down under the fuel tank, and the fuel sending unit. And I'm just not comfortable leaving CPE back there under, you know, up to the, coming out of the fuel pump, going up to the regulator, it's probably 80 PSI, 100 PSI. And then it's, you know, then it splits off and the return line comes back. And I just don't want to leave CPE sitting there under pressure, you know, the whole time between the fuel pump and the regulator, just cranking away at 80, 90 PSI with gasoline in it. And end up with a fire. And I've already had that happen once already. I've had the CPE start leaking already. And I've replaced it once already, but I was in the middle doing a bunch of other stuff and I didn't want to get involved pulling the sending unit out and all that. Something else with the sending unit, I'm going to pull the camera. Something else I noticed with the sending unit after driving the car, putting some miles on it, is the fuel pump doesn't read low. It hangs. And what's common on these cars, and I'm going to grab a little piece of paper here and show you what I'm talking about. I should have left the damn camera in the tripod, but I wasn't thinking about that. So the way this fuel tank is shaped inside is you've got the floor of the fuel tank, and then it turns and it goes up the front wall. So this is front, towards front. The sending unit mounts up here on the top of the tank and extends down. The fuel pump extends down and the pickup goes down in that bottom front corner, which is where you want it because the fuel is going to flow downhill Obviously, that's going to be the lowest point in the tank, so that's where the fuel pump pickup's going to be. The gauge sender mounts, got a box, and it's got an arm coming off with a float, and the float is way out here, right on the front wall of the tank. And as the fuel level goes up and down, it grabs this float, moves it up and down. There's a resistor here that sends a voltage signal to the gauge and tells the gauge where it's at. The problem is these tanks have not only a single steel wall that you see from the outside, but they also have a plastic liner inside, which was accident fire prevention under GM at the time. And over time, what happens is this liner starts to degrade a little bit. It doesn't dissolve, but it warps, and you get a bulge in the inside of the tank. So what happens is the sending unit float, when a tank is full, the float's way up here, and as you're driving, it's moving up and down and everything's fine. But after the level of the fuel drops a little bit, the float hits the bulge on the front of the tank and just sits there. So you'll watch the gauge drop from full to 3/4 to 5/8 to, down to about 1/4 of a tank, and then it'll never read lower than that because it's hanging up on that bulge in the sending unit, the bulge in the tank. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not into swapping this whole fuel tank out right now. The tank's tight, it doesn't look bad. Other than the bulge in the liner, I have no issue with it, so I just can't justify spending $400, $500, $600 on a tank. So what I'm going to do is I need to take the sending unit out anyway to change to modify the lines on top to accept AN compressions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this fuel sending rod and I'm going to cut it and shorten it and just move the float away from the wall a little bit. And we'll go through that process too and how I do this with keeping the alignment of the gauge correct and all that. And the gauge is not correct right now because when I fill this thing all the way to the top, it's still only reading like, 3/4, 7/8 of a tank. It never shows full. So I know that this aftermarket sending unit, this rod is bent a little for cockta anyway. So I'm going to be modifying that angle to try and make the gauge read a little higher as well, which means moving the float a little lower because that will push the resistor arm up. But we'll cover that in detail in a few minutes. Hey, just something I wanted to touch on before I forget about it. I wanted to clarify a couple things after listening back to that last video piece was the PTFE fittings can, of course, be reused, but at the very least, you need to replace that ferrule because the ferrule is going to get collapsed, and then trying to get it to slip over and seal on a new piece of PTFE line is just not going to be practical. So the ferrules are readily available. They're cheap. I usually have a bunch on hand as well. But honestly, I don't reuse a whole lot of AN line fittings. Usually when I build stuff, it's built and it's done. And if I'm running fresh lines, I use fresh fittings. And, so I don't reuse a whole lot. But in a pinch, keep a bunch of the ferrules on hand, and you can disconnect these, remove them, change the line, put them on a different PTFE line, and you're fine. But you got to replace that ferrule. The other upside to PTFE over CPE is temperature resistance. Obviously they're both stainless braided and then a nylon on top of that, so they're really well built to resist abrasion and getting roughed up and having sharp steel cut into them, that kind of thing. The stainless braids are super tough, but temperature is a whole different ballgame. The CPE, the rubber hose, is only good to about 200 degrees or so. So it's fine for some light, low pressure fuel line maybe, or anything that's going to be lower pressure, lower temperature, but anytime you start talking about, coolant lines that are running up to 200, oil and trans lines that are going to be 200 plus in some cases, although your trans shouldn't hit 200 degrees, but you know what I mean. It just seems like I'd rather have much more overhead as far as temperature resistance. Plus the fact that you're running these through an engine compartment or near an exhaust or by a cat that's going to be a couple hundred degrees. And the last thing you want is that rubber to start to break down and leak, especially around fuel lines. So PTFE has a temperature resistance somewhere around 500 degrees. So while I wouldn't run it across an exhaust manifold, but you'll still be able to run it through an engine compartment and not be worried about, underhood temps or being too close to an exhaust. If you're running a fuel line up the frame rail or a remote oil or trans cooler to the back of the car or something like that, the last thing you want is to have that exhaust system heat burning into that hose and starting to break the rubber down. So PTFE gets you about a 500 degree cap on temperature. Which is more than enough. And like I said, unless you're running it on a cat, which would just be dumb, or on an exhaust manifold. So the two other pros in PTFE. Like I said, you can reuse the fittings technically. Once they get chewed up, they're not that expensive, and once they get beat up, I like my stuff looking sexy, so I tend to replace them when they start getting too beat up. And of course, you have to replace the ferrules, so that's a necessary evil of using the PTFE. But they're not expensive. I mean, they break. You can buy a whole kit, an assortment pack of like 6 and 8 ANs for like $10-12. It's not a big deal. Certainly not prohibitive. And then of course temperature resistance. But all right, let's get ready to start pulling the fuel pump out of this, pulling the fuel sender out of this tank, and get to work. All right, so these actually come out pretty easy. I've already taken the bezel off and the door. Basically, you open the door up and there's 4 screws on the inside, and then there's a black rubber boot that catches any overflow when you're filling and has a drain hose. You can fold that in and get it to come out, and I use a hook pick to get around the bulge on the top of the filter neck, because it'll be tucked underneath here, so you'll get a hook pick and work it around, and you can get it to come out. As they get old, they get brittle and tear. That happened to the original. The one I use now is an aftermarket replacement, but it works well. So these actually come out pretty easily. It can be a little tricky to get it to work its way out because the sending unit is pretty big, but I'll disconnect the harness. Get my vent line off of this side. I did reuse the vent to the tank because I want that to be, I don't want that to build any vacuum in there. The vent hose is tight, but it's just 1/4 inch rubber. You give it a twist, it'll pop right off. And then here's my CPE lines coming up from the filter regulator. I've got a C5 Corvette filter regulator down under the tank, mounted to the frame that regulates it down to 58 PSI, which is another issue because I wanted to reuse and run a single fuel line up to the engine, which is fine. So I put the regulator back here, but in hindsight, it probably would have been better off having the regulator up by the engine, because having the regulator back here at the tank and then running a single fuel line all the way up to the engine, it actually nets me a fuel pressure drop. So I get about 56.5 PSI at the engine. So I've got to go back in and adjust my injector flow rates to compensate for that. And then these guys can be a pain in the butt, but it's just a barb fitting with a bulge on the end. It's not even like it's not a sharp-edged barb. And these guys will come off. Just takes a little doing. There might be a little residual pressure in that pressure line to show a little gas spill, but so those are off. And they're only about 4 feet long. They run under the tank. The filter's right down underneath. And so I'll pull those through. Once I get down underneath, I'll disconnect and I'll pull these lines out. So that's it. 3 lines in the connector. And then we'll start pulling the bolts out. And that's it. So now this guy, once you get that vent hose tucked around the bottom of it, will come up and you got to rotate it around. The biggest problem is clearing these fittings on the outside. And when I set up the new, I'm going to mount AN fittings on these lines. And when I do, I'm going to have to be conscious of how far they stick out. But it'll clear. You just kind of find the right spot for it. Remember, the sender inside is 24 inches long or so. And then the float, of course, is floating up. I could have sworn it went to the right last time, but let's see here. Here we go. So it just took a little finagling, but it's about 11 o'clock or 10:30 position, and eventually you can get it to come out. And here comes the sender. Careful I don't bend this float any more than I need to, because I kind of need to know where it is right now, so that when I set up the angle to correct the gauge reading, I'm just going to squeeze the float over towards the fuel pump to narrow it, so I can sneak the sock out. That's it. And then once you get the sock and the float out, then you're out. I mean, I'm going to go put this on the bench, and I'll be right back. Here's my buddies. These are my daily. They come almost every day looking for breakfast, so let's oblige them here. My daughter has talked about naming them.
Hi, you are currently being recorded.
Little apple flavored deer coin. They gobble this stuff up.
Hi, you are currently being recorded.
Yeah. You guys are timid today. Is the tripod freaking you out or what? The one closest looking at me right now is the male. He's definitely the most assertive. Well, it's funny. He's the guy that comes right into the garage here. I've been over working on my tool or workbench, and I look over and I only see his head sticking up over the back of the Corvette looking at me. Like, yo, dude, where's breakfast? We're here. I think that tripod might be freaking him out. Oh, well. All right, let's get on the sending unit. So there's those lines. The outside line is the pressure feed going into the filter / regulator, and the center one is the return that goes back up to the tank and dumps back the excess pressure back in the tank. So I'm going to loosen these two guys up and pull the lines out. I'm going to save you from sitting here watching me on my back, getting drenched in whatever residual fuel is left in the line, which I don't think is much, but you can see the problem is if I have a leak on these lines, it's kind of right on top of the exhaust. It's not a happy place to be. And it's all right. I'm going to pop these lines off. I'll see you in a minute. All right, so there they are. There's the 6 ends that were down on the fuel pump, fuel filter regulator, and then there's the open ends. These lines will get tossed. I'll probably save these fittings, although this one's pretty beat up, but that one's clean. So I'll pull those fittings off, but the line will likely get tossed. I don't reuse it. I end up using it someplace, and I'll have fuel saturated rubber on the inside. Let's see, and that's got a little, almost feels soft right there too. And that's the problem with the fuel. You run ethanolated fuel, like E85 or E90, or God forbid you run ethanol, it'll eat right through this rubber. That even feels like a soft spot right there. You can almost see the indent. And so yeah, and like I said, this stuff isn't expensive, so I'm just I'll toss it rather than be worried about using it someplace else and having to have already been weakened from the fuel in it. All right, let's get this guy off of here. They also make soft jaw kits, like brass jaw kits with a hex cut in it just for doing these. But this will work just fine if you're careful. So there's that CPE fitting, no ferrule, just a taper and threads. And the outer cap, the outer cover on a CPE fitting is actually threaded. The idea is that as you're tightening it down onto the connection, it'll draw the hose into this clamp. It won't allow the clamp to slide past and the hose to slide out. So it keeps a grip on the hose. Am I going the right direction? No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm a dope. And you'll see some little extra masking tape coming out that was still on the line. There we go. Because when you cut these with a steel braid, you need to tape over the end. If you don't tape the end when you cut them, the stainless steel braid will fray out. It'll like tulip out, and it becomes impossible to get a fitting over it. So we tape them first and then cut it with an abrasive cutter or cutoff wheel. And that's it. So these lines are junk. Let's have masking tape crap out of there. There's a decent shot of those threads up inside there. I don't know if you can see them. Here's my flashlight. You can see the threads that grip the outer sleeve on the braided line. And those threads are in good shape. Those threads are in good shape. It's got some rubber on it from being into the hose, because the hose will actually thread right up into the hose. I had a little bit of hose on it. So these need to be cleaned a little bit, but these are reusable. So I'll reuse these guys. Save them for a rainy day. Hi there. Hello, how are you? This fitting's pretty beat up, but keep as an emergency, it might be worth it. The threads aren't chewed up. I don't know, it's pretty beat up. I think this one's going to get tossed. That looks pretty okay. Yeah, I don't know. Nope, not worth it. Trash. Go through the lines out, and we'll start modifying the sending unit. All right, just to confirm, that's the supply line coming out, the feed line, and as you can see, that's 375, so that's our 3/8. And then there's about a 312, 315, so that's our 5/16. So that is 3/8 and 5/16 lines coming in, so we have the right compression ends. And what we're going to do, I don't know why they give you this Teflon tape, I don't use it anywhere. Not doing this anyway. These are compression ANs. So basically you take a steel line, or a hard line rather, and you can put an AN fitting on the end, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to cut these barbs off. And then these are compression fittings. And that's obviously the 5/16 side. Comes with a couple of extra ferrules, which is always nice. That one got one in it. Yeah, that one's already got one in it. I only need one 5/16 and one 3/8, so I'm going to put this away in my kit. More free shitty Teflon tape, and there's the 3/8 size. That's got a ferrule, and we'll go in my box. I had to give you two extra. Oh no, there's two of there. Never mind. Yep, and there's a ferrule on the 3/8 as well. So these, of course, are sized for the line size they're going on. They're both 6AN on that end, but one's a 3/8 and one's a 5/16. A couple of extra ferrules. Always nice to have spares. Throw one of these in my toolbox, and I'll throw one in the other toolbox just to have as an emergency. I mean, it's Teflon tape; it'll do the job, but I find that the little free kits they give you usually, it's like super thin too. You got to put like 20 wraps around the fitting. If you buy better stuff, you know, regular mechanic grade or plumbing grade Teflon tape, it tends to be a little thicker. All right, so keeping in mind that I want to minimize the amount that the new AN fitting sticks out, because they need to be able to get the sender back in without having to trim that deck lid. But I need to be able to clear the back end of this sleeve. So I need, making a witness mark here. So it is going to stick out a little further than the stock line. I don't think that'll be an issue. Like, if worse comes to worse, I can trim that that deck lid overhang to clear it. And the steel line will go up inside this a little bit. This will be about 1/4 of an inch past that. See where that goes. So the the fitting has a recess with a stop for the hard line. If you can catch it in the glare. So that stop is down 440, 340, 340 from the end of this flare. So if I line this up where it was and mark where the end of the fitting is, and I come back 340, that should get me to where the line needs to actually stop. And that'll be that right there. Same here. I would suspect these are probably the same, but who knows? Yeah, a little shallower. So 310. So we'll do the same thing here, although I think this one's going to have more room because this line is pushed further back in already. So, and I've got to clear that bracket on the back side. So yeah, we're in further already. So I'm going to line up. Actually, it looks like the back side of the nut on the core of the fitting lines up with the back end of the flare is a pretty good spot to be. So we will line this up with the back end of the flare. Eyeball mark right there. And then we're going to come in 310 from that. So that'll be our line marks. And no, I'm not worried about being overly precise, because you know what, when I start cutting this thing, there's going to be a bunch of kerf from the blade. It's going to be a 32nd or a 16th variance. And again, this isn't brain surgery. One concern I do have is once I get these lines cut, we'll see how these fittings slip over, is how much clearance I'm going to have around the base plate and then between the two nuts on the inside. I may end up having to cut these brackets off and pull these lines up and apart to make some room for the fittings. I'm not worried about that right now. I can deal with that once I get the lines cut and the fittings mocked up. I've had this good and cleaned out. I let it dry out, drained it out, let it dry out for a bit. I think probably the easiest way is going to be to cut this with a rotary tool, which is going to generate a bunch of heat and sparks. And if there's any gas vapor left in those lines, we might have a little blowtorch for a second, but I don't think it'll be a big deal. Who knows? You little bugger, get out of me. All right, just clean these guys up. Gotta be a better way. I'm glad we didn't have a fireworks show. Like I said, I let it drain out and let it air dry for a while so so most of the vapor would evaporate off. Kind of glad. This is a pain in the butt. What do we got? What do we got? I need a little sanding wheel or something on that Dremel, but I'm too lazy to go get it. All right, old-fashioned way. That fitting I'm pushing my thumb around is still pretty darn hot. We do want these to be nice and straight cut at the end, because I want it to seat all the way in. The top's clean. Bottom still got some lippage on it from the pressure from the cutoff tool. And the line's clean up where the ferrule is going to sit and seal, so I'm not worried about that other than the ink mark. As long as the ferrule slips over and gets home and I get all the way on the fitting, then we're in good shape. Yeah, the ferrule slips over, no problem. And fitting seats all the way down fine. And it does touch. So I may end up either having to cut a relief right there or tweaking the line out. Let's see. And of course I need to clean up the inside as well and then blow this all out. I mean, yeah, of course there's going to be a little bit of grimy dust that's going to get down into these pipes also. We'll deal with the same thing when we're cutting the line. We've got to blow it all out once we're done and the test fitting is done and get it cleaned out. I mean, I'm worried about a couple of tiny grains of filings that are going to get picked up by the filter, no problem, but you don't want to leave a ton of junk in there. Anything that gets in the return side is going to go back into the tank and it'll get strained out by the sock anyway, and anything that goes down the pressure side here is going to get picked up by the fuel filter, but that doesn't mean I want to just recklessly let a ton of filings and junk get down in there. Man, if this wasn't so tight to the flange for the tank, this would be a lot easier. Am I off camera? Oh my god, I am off camera. What a jerk. Just cleaning up that inside edge. Make sure that's nice and clean. There isn't a big lip there that's going to interfere with fuel flow. It's a nice transition. So there it is, it's in. The only challenge really was getting to those fittings back there. What I ended up using was a crow's foot like this, so I could actually sneak in and get on the fitting and then turn it with a ratchet, and you can actually use an open end to grab that hex and hold it. It's under pressure right now. It's obviously nice and tight. Both lines are on and connected underneath. And that's that. The only thing left to go in is the boot and the fuel cap, or the fuel door. This is a drain line. Basically, it's just a drain. So any overflow that comes out when you're filling goes down the drain, because drains out the bottom. And I just said, like a video ago, how much I hate watching videos where people try and juggle stuff with one hand, and here I go. I'm too lazy to go get my tripod. This is the hardest part, is getting it over the filler neck, because it's got a big bulge there. And the rest of this boot just tucks underneath. The original one that was on the car was 40 some odd years old. The rubber had gotten so stiff that the first time I took this thing out, it just split. As you can see, it's got to be pretty flexible to get in there. And make sure that's kind of centered, because the hinge and the spring for the fuel door need to go in the center right there. So that just sits in there like that. There's no retention for it other than the fuel door assembly goes down here. There's that. And that's that. Well, hope you enjoyed this little vid. Got something out of it. Hey, do me a favor. Like, subscribe, share. Do what you got to do. Spread the word. Not like I'm looking to make money off of this YouTube channel, but it's a heck of a lot of fun. And I get lots of good feedback from folks that get some stuff out of the projects I work on. And it's not going to be all Corvette stuff. There's always going to be occasional bike stuff and maybe some household stuff and who knows what. Family shenanigans with Maggie the shop dog and all that good stuff. And so, yeah, do me a favor, subscribe and share it, as share any of my videos as you like to, and comment and like it and all that good stuff. And who knows where this will go. But y'all have a great day. I'll see you soon. Next project, I think I'm going to be redoing the scoop on the Vette. I've modified it, so I'll go through some of the modifications I made, and then I'm going to wrap it in carbon fiber to give it a more uniform look and kind of refine the shape a little bit. But yeah, check back for new videos, and thanks very much for checking in. I'll see you later. Bye.